This video is about the organelle called the mitochondria, also called the powerhouse of the cell. Anything that you look up on the internet, it's going to be called the powerhouse. Because the mitochondria is where the chemical reactions occur that transfer energy from organic compounds, also called food, to ATP, which is energy. Okay, so mitochondria are the organelles that transfer energy from food to mitochondria, or sorry, to energy. If a cell requires more energy, it's going to have more mitochondria. So for example, your hair cells don't need that much energy, so they don't have a lot of mitochondria. Your skin cells don't need a lot of energy, don't need a lot of mitochondria. But your muscle cells need tons of energy. So one muscle cell can have several thousand mitochondria in that one cell. And this is a microscopic photo of a mitochondria. So the first thing I want you to notice also from this little diagram here is that inside the mitochondria, you have a membrane that is highly folded. And I have mentioned in a previous video what folding means in biology. And you're going to see it here. So the inner folded membrane is called the cristae. By the way, you'll notice in the book that sometimes after a vocabulary word, it will have in brackets. This is what's called phonetics. And I'm not sure if you guys are part of the group in elementary school that were able to learn English using phonetics, but when I took French in high school, phonetics really, really helped my understanding of how to pronounce words. So basically it's a description of how to say the word. So it's all broken up by syllable. Let me get rid of that. It's broken up by syllable, and the syllable that's in all caps is the one that is stressed. And it's just written literally how you pronounce it. So it's Christy. So you emphasize the Christy. Again, the Christy is folded because that allows for higher surface area. Now, the chemical reactions that create the ATP from the food actually occur in these membranes. So the more folding you have, the more membrane you can have in one organelle, and the more membrane you have, the more ATP you can make. Again, more surface area from folding. If you had a mitochondria like this and your inner membrane was just a straight line, it would be a lot less membrane surface area. So you would not be able to make as much ATP. So again, here's a diagram compared to the real thing. And so you can see the cristae there folded in the inner membrane. Now, the mitochondria are extremely unique in the fact that they have their own DNA, separate from the DNA that's in the nucleus. Also, mitochondria can only reproduce by the division of pre-existing mitochondria. It sounds a lot like the cell theory when we say new cells can only come from old cells. New mitochondria can only come from old mitochondria. It's not like the cell can make new mitochondria from scrap parts. So mitochondria and also chloroplasts, when I talk about plant organelles, they share the same characteristics. They have a double membrane, which is unique for organelles except for the nucleus. A double membrane. Every other organelle has only a single membrane. Mitochondria have a double membrane, and it has their own DNA. So this evidence has led scientists to believe that both mitochondria and chloroplasts originated from prokaryotic cells that were incorporated into ancient eukaryotic cells. And this theory is called endosymbiosis. So again, breaking down words, cis is process, symbio is a relationship, and endo is inside. So a process of a relationship, something about inside.
There are a lot of amazing theories in science. the general theory of relativity, atomic theory, the cell theory. And one thing we want to point out about a scientific theory is that it's a lot different from how you might use the word theory in your daily life. A scientific theory is not an educated guess. A scientific theory is an explanation of a scientific event, supported by scientific evidence. It must be testable and tested over and over and over again. And while theories can be changed or even disproven, you do want to realize there are a lot of facts behind them. One of our favorite theories of all time is the endosymbiotic theory. We love it because we just find the events in this theory to be amazing. The theory gives an explanation for how eukaryote cells could have evolved from prokaryote cells that lived in symbiosis. Prokaryote symbiosis means these organisms live together. So, just to recap from our Intro to Cells video, when you think of prokaryote, think of pro rhyming with no, no nucleus, no membrane bound organelles. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, remember eu rhymes with do, and they do have a nucleus and other membrane bound organelles. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are cells, though, and therefore they do have a few things in common that cells have, including a cell membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and genetic material. But just look at these two cell types and you will see that one is way more simple. So, what explanation does the endosymbiotic theory provide for how eukaryote cells could have evolved from prokaryote cells? A long, long time ago, seriously, a long time, over 2 billion years ago, there were prokaryotes, much like there are today. They've been around for a long time. Well, just as there are in many organisms, there was variety in prokaryotes. Some of the prokaryotes had photosynthetic abilities, which means they could make their own food using sunlight energy. And those were the photosynthetic bacteria. Some of these prokaryotes were bacteria that had the ability to use oxygen to produce ATP energy. And some prokaryotes were larger, they could consume others, engulfing them. So obviously they had to be larger. The endosymbiotic theory is that some of these large cells engulfed some of these small bacteria. But instead of those small bacteria getting digested, some of them remained intact and they actually began to live as symbionts. That means they lived together. This is believed to be the ancestor heterotroph eukaryote cell. And eventually, some of these cells engulfed the small bacteria that could do photosynthesis in addition. And there were some more living as symbionts. This is believed to be the ancestor autotroph eukaryote. Now, it's time to do a little reveal. We consider the bacteria that used oxygen to produce their own energy to have evolved into what is now mitochondria. And the bacteria that use sunlight energy to produce their own food, well, we consider those to have evolved into what are now chloroplasts. It's likely that these ancient eukaryotes had some kind of advantage in their endosymbiosis, and it's also likely that the mitochondria developed first, before the chloroplast, because if you remember from our Intro to Cells video, nearly all eukaryote cells have mitochondria. It's just that eukaryote cells that can do photosynthesis can have both mitochondria and chloroplast. Now, if you remember our beginning about theories, you may be wondering, where are the facts for this? We'll give you a few of the facts. First, mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. Yes, separate DNA from what is found in the nucleus. Not to mention that their DNA is arranged in a similar way to prokaryote DNA, specifically bacterial DNA. The size of mitochondria and chloroplasts tend to be similar to the size of bacteria. And when mitochondria and chloroplasts divide, which they can divide all on their own independently, they divide in a way that is similar to how bacteria divide. So, the endosymbiotic theory provides an explanation for how modern eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes. There's obviously more questions you might want to explore. For example, what about some of the other structures and organelles in eukaryotes? Well, keep exploring. Secondary endosymbiosis is a great place to start. One last thing we want to make sure to emphasize: endosymbiosis isn't just reserved for a theory that explains a past event in ancient history. No, because endosymbiosis is actually happening today with many other kinds of organisms. One of our favorite examples: the termite. Yes, termites can have prokaryotes that live in their gut and help them digest wood. And without them, well, let's just say digesting wood wouldn't happen so well. Well, that's it for the Biba sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, so important thing that they talked about at the end there, that endosymbiosis doesn't just occur in our eukaryotic cells, but it's an ongoing thing. Not just termites, but also what we call ruminant animals like cows and pigs and sheep and horses, and animals that only eat grass, because the main carbohydrate in grass is cellulose, and we mammals do not have any enzymes that can break down cellulose. So you might think, well, how are they able to be vegetarian if they can't break down cellulose? And that's because these types of animals, there's two different structures that they have to deal with it, and one of them relies on having a symbiotic relationship with microorganisms like bacteria in their gut to help them break down the cellulose. Anyway, so the endosymbiosis theory is a symbiotic relationship provided prokaryotes with a place to live. And in exchange, the prokaryotes provided the eukaryotic cells with an increased amount of ATP. And you can see that that holds true for both mitochondria and chloroplasts. And this is all backed up by the evidence that both mitochondria and chloroplasts have a double membrane, and they each have their own DNA separate from the cell DNA in the nucleus.